Nationwide protests over police brutality.
Over the last 10 years, sea levels have risen at an alarming rate.
Western wildfires about the size of New Jersey.
Devastating unemployment nationwide.
Have I done a good job?
2,777 COVID deaths.
Have I done a good job?
With faith in America and in each other, let us be the nation that we know we can be.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Democracy on the Brink. I'm your host, Santita Jackson, and it's a joy, it's a pleasure, it's a blessing to be with you on this, the Martin Luther King holiday weekend. Indeed, this is his birthday. Today, January 15th, he would have been 91 years of age, the Prince of Peace, the drum major for justice, the Nobel Prize winner. Well, you know how he did that. You know how he made all of these strides in creating this beloved community. He did it as a grassroots organizer. And that's really the theme of this show today, grassroots organizing. We've got three of the best. George Gale from People's Action, and he has a podcast, To See Each Other. Indeed, that is what he has done. He and his team did something that Dr. King would have done. More than 10,000 people they reached out to, 15 to 20-minute conversations, one-on-one. And many of these persons on both sides of the conversation might not have agreed with each other, but after they talked to each other with radical empathy, as he calls it, they were enlightened by each other and they changed each other's minds. Yours might be changed too. And we've got Hector Sanchez Barba, the CEO of Mi Familia Vota. Indeed, in the next few years, the largest voting bloc of people of color in the United States will be the Latinx population. How is he galvanizing them? How is he organizing them? How is he empowering them? As Dr. King did with Cesar Chavez. We're going to hear about it. And Liz Hume, the Alliance for Peace Building. They do their work overseas. But the argument has been made within that organization and primarily by Ms. Hume that kind of peace building, the work on breaking down the structures that make sexism and racism and all forms of classism possible, that kind of breaking down of those structures needs to happen not just overseas, but here in the United States. So sit back and be enlightened, but do what Dr. King would do. Get involved. And we want you to be involved with us. Look at your social media, get involved. Let us know what you think about this show. And in the spirit of Dr. King, figure out what you can do to help create this beloved community. Stay with us for Democracy on the Brink. You know, we're living in a time when people really need to see each other. They need to hear each other. They need to be with one another. And people need to take action. And so we've got this gentleman, George Gale, People's Action, and he's also the host of his own podcast, To See Each Other. Wow. Welcome to Democracy on the Brink, George Gale.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You have been having these one-on-one conversations, 15 to 20 minutes long, pre-COVID, of course, with people. You decided not to be judgmental.
Mm-hmm.
That, I know I'm a progressive, but I want to talk to people who are on the other side of the aisle, if you will. And I want them to be able to talk to me, to feel that they can talk to me. I need you to explain this deep canvassing process that you have utilized to get people to open up and talk to you. And you actually changed some minds along the way.
Yeah, it's really working. So in 2016, as Donald Trump was ascending, and we felt like we wanted to be in conversation with more people in rural communities, we launched what is one of the biggest kind of progressive, race-conscious rural organizing programs in the country, and went out in 2017, knocked on 10,000 doors. This was not deep canvassing. This was just listening. And we asked people what issues they cared about. Like, what do you see as the solutions? And how are you making meaning of the changing context in your community? And then people identified issues. People talked about the lack of clean water. They talked about factory farms coming into the community, the need for opioid relief, wage issues, And we organized people and brought people together, often across race, across class, certainly across gender, to win on those issues. And we won things. We, stopped some factory farms, won opioid relief, expanded healthcare. And along the way, people started to have conversations about racism, and race as a system that was creating different outcomes for different people, but is also the reason we probably weren't in the room together winning in the first place. So we were really proud, felt like we were winning, some good stuff was happening. And this included people across the political spectrum coming together to get stuff done. And we kept running into immigration and immigration reform as a bridge too far for some folks. So we wanted to learn more about that and have conversations with folks. And we decided to test out deep canvassing. So deep canvassing, these are long form, as you said, 15 to 20 minute conversations with somebody on their front porch, and to talk about an issue where there's often conflict or disagreement. And what's unique about deep canvassing is that we don't judge folks. We show radical empathy for wherever people are coming from. We try to understand people's struggles and understand how they're making meaning of the world. And then we share that. So we definitely do as much listening as talking. Traditional canvassing, which we think of as kind of verbal leafleting, is coming by with a quick pitch, trying to convince people to think like you do. And something magical opens up in these conversations because people are like, wait, you're not here to judge me? You're not throwing facts at me? You're not debating me? Okay, let's talk. And we ran an experiment in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Michigan to see if we could build support for a more welcoming immigration policy. And we were able to increase support for that by 20%. And that change lasted at least 4.5 months. That was the last point at which we measured, all from one conversation with a perfect stranger. So we've come to believe that deep canvassing and this way of approaching each other, of seeing each other, can have big impact, especially in this moment in the country when we're so polarized.
Absolutely. But radical empathy, where does that come from? I mean, it's interesting to me that you talked about really going to someone's home. That's very disarming.
Mm-hmm.
People relax when we're at home. That's why the talk show format, you're almost in someone's living room, right? Radical empathy, I need you to explain that to me, because these people felt that these outsiders who come in to question them armed with these great academic credentials would shame them.
Yeah.
I'm a factory worker, I'm a basic person, but you're coming from these great schools and on and on and on. But you didn't come at them that way. You came at them person to person. Am I right?
For sure. I think that's exactly right. So I think a couple things, like one, we have to come in truly curious about the other person, about their struggles, about what they're up against, about how they're thinking about the world, and about how they've come. What about their life journey has led them to make this meaning of this moment in American life? And we have to really want to know. And we also have to come in with a sense of we're not really concerned and we're not going to judge you around where you are right now, but we are curious if you're willing to go on a journey to rethink some things. And so then when somebody says something that we may not agree with, we have to just be like, that's where that person is right now. Versus and I think right now our culture is in a moment where we want a little bit of a gotcha thing. It's like, aha, you said the wrong thing and I'm going to jump on you right there. And I will say deep canvassing isn't for everybody. Some people are like, yeah, I can't do this. I want to get into a debate and argue with people. But other people, even people who started maybe because they needed a job as a canvasser, they were curious, have said to me over and over, they're like, I am done judging people. I'm done assuming that people are unmovable, because I've gone up into way north rural Michigan or into trailer courts, in North Carolina, and found people are people are movable and open to rethinking things, but also they're generally good. We just think differently on this thing. And so I think, it's a beautiful thing that's happening in this project is definitely we're impacting the people whose door we knock on, but also the canvassers are really rethinking, kind of prejudging people.
What did you learn in this post-Obama, Trump ascendant era when you were doing that deep canvassing?
Yeah, it's so interesting. There are 700 counties that voted for President Obama twice. A third of those voted for Donald Trump, and the swings were often 20 to 30%, which is just kind of really mind-boggling. So, but I think we learned one, especially through the listening, the 10,000 conversations I mentioned at the beginning, is people really did feel unheard and unseen. And I think actually most low-income and working class people in America feel unheard and unseen. So I just want to make that clear. But people over and over, when we knocked on people's doors, that people would say, you know what? Nobody's ever asked me before. Like, thank you so much for coming here and just asking me what I think.
Women caring enough to ask me what I think and how I've lived. Yes.
Yes, exactly. I'm like actually curious about how you think about these things. And I'm not here to tell you to think like me. I think that it was very unique. And I think actually really the opposite of how we do much of our politics right now. So I think people really appreciated that. And I think people are both experiencing significant economic decline in a lot of communities that have really just kind of been blown out through kind of deindustrialization and other issues, and are trying to make meaning of the changing demographics of the country. And I think those two things combined have created an opportunity where some extreme right-wing forces are really preying on that. And I think those of us that want to see a more just society need to figure out how to create an alternative for folks. And that alternative definitely starts by being in real, authentic relationship.
Is there any tie that you've seen between the rural, urban, and suburban communities? Are there any places where people can come together? I mean, you've got this mid-sized city like Flint, for example, that has a lead water crisis, but we're both from Chicago.
Right.
We also have a lead water problem that no one is talking about, for example. It's all over the country. I mean, are there any ties that bind us?
I'd say first, definitely just the feeling of being unheard and unseen actually binds us. And so I think, I mean, one of the interesting things that happened in the deep canvassing work is on the doors before COVID hit and we needed to move to phones, was about half of the canvassers were canvassers of color. Many were immigrants or children of immigrants going into like overwhelmingly white rural communities to talk about immigration, which one I think is super courageous. And these are folks like doing some of the most important work in the country. A lot of folks were like, I didn't know there was like white poverty. I didn't know 18 million white people lived in poverty in this country. Like that's a thing. Like I'm going to think about that. So I think you're like, oh, there's actually some commonality. But to the issue you brought up, I actually think there's no issue that unites people more than clean water or the lack of it. If you're a family farmer who lives in a community that's had corporate agriculture come in and you got these big factory hog farms and they're polluting the water, you live in Flint, Michigan, or you live in Chicago, like issues like that. The top 5 issues that came up in our rural canvas were healthcare, lack of clean water, addiction, better schools, and jobs. That sounds to me like an urban agenda too. Like that doesn't sound unique to rural. So I think there's so much commonality. But really progressive forces have almost no infrastructure in rural communities and even these kind of mid-sized communities. There's actually not that much organizing happening in the Kenosha's or Reading, Pennsylvania's or Erie's. And that's something we've got to fix.
Well, you know, Republicans write progressives or rural, I mean, and Black and brown communities off for their own sets of reasons, but I think that Democrats can do that too. Progressives can do that. We all do a fair amount of writing each other off and not we don't see each other, right? We don't see each other. What about, I mean, now you're doing phone canvassing. I mean, pre-COVID, right? Why did you move into phone canvassing? I mean, because to me, the one-on-one knocking on someone's door, ringing their doorbell, that's so effective. Was phone canvassing as effective?
Or when COVID hit, we felt loss at people's action on so many fronts, like everybody. And one of the greatest senses of loss and reasons of loss was this sense like, wow, we can't go knock on doors. Like this is the thing we've been building, this big program to go talk to hundreds of thousands of people on the doors. So we didn't know at first if it would work, but we said, well, we got to try phones because we can't put the canvassers in danger. We didn't understand that much about the pandemic yet. And so we started testing phones. And actually the first 2 tests we ran were helping people think about the uprisings following the murder of George Floyd. So just testing on the phones, would people engage in a conversation? And we also had an experiment where we had conversations with folks to help people think about our relationship with China as President Trump was trying to stir up anti-Chinese sentiment. So those were 2 little experiments we ran. And we actually found people were way more likely to pick up the phones than we might have thought. And we think some of that, this is anecdotal, but was based on the pandemic and that people are lonely and people like were really kind of starving for connection and trying to make meaning. And a lot of people don't have enough people in their lives to do that with. And so we actually found, at that time, around 5% of the phone calls we made, we'd actually have a conversation with people. And a really interesting one, as we moved into those conversations, which were often about COVID, we'd call up and, you got a stranger calling you, and people aren't as excited about phone calls as they used to be. And we would ask people like, how are you doing? Like, we're in a global pandemic, and universally everybody would say, you know what, I'm fine. In large part because they're talking to a stranger. And then the canvasser would be like, you know what, I'm not fine. Like, I'm worried about my grandchildren not getting their education. I'm worried about my grandma catching COVID, whatever it was. And then the person on the end of the line would kind of melt a little bit and go, you know what, I'm not fine either. And then they would start to share experiences about how they're struggling in the pandemic. And they may be similar, but there was almost always some common ground. So we actually found, at least in the context of a pandemic, phones work.
Because it's company, right? Like your television.
Yes.
But what about this moment in which we find ourselves right now? Because you have really been, I think it was very prudent to go to people in this post-Obama period, in this not only Trump ascendant, but Sanders ascendant period.
Right.
As people toggle between the two of them. But now we've seen something that that's been unsettling to Americans. We've seen something that we haven't seen in more than 100 years, the storming of the Capitol. We're looking at the possible demonstrations that could become contentious, I'll put it that way, at 50 capitals all across the country, the lower 48 and Hawaii and Alaska. What kind of deep canvassing, if you could deep canvass those who stormed the Capitol last week, just without judgment, since you do employ radical empathy, which is genius, what would you say?
One, I would say this is the master class for deep canvassing. So you put a big challenge in front of us, and that's not usually who we're canvassing, but I would say we would really try to understand what the person is up against in their life first. Like, what are they dealing with, whether it's addiction, job insecurity, feeling stuck in terms of kind of moving up the economic ladder, concern for the kids, whatever it is. We'd really try to understand that first and foremost. And then we would share what we were up against and what we were trying to understand. And then we would try to understand how they've made whatever meaning they've made in the world that led to that action. We would really want to understand it versus jump on everything that was wrong about either their analysis or the action, which would be very hard. It's not, again, not something everybody could pull off. And then we'd share our understanding of how we're making meaning of the moment, but not in a way to destroy the person in an argument. Basically, it's funny, when I give talks around the country about deep canvassing, people come up, there's usually a line of people like, oh, I am having conversations with people I don't see eye to eye with in the exact wrong way. I'm arming myself with a bunch of facts and I'm coming to beat them in an argument. Nobody wants to lose an argument. Nobody wants to be, beaten down into being like, oh, everything you think is wrong. So there's something about this deep canvassing conversation where people are like, wait, this person seems to actually want to understand what I think and what I'm up against, that then they're able to start to have kind of a cone of curiosity with the other person and start to try to understand each other. I think deep canvassing this group would be a hard project, but I think that we're going to need deep canvassing at scale, I think, to get enough of the country together and on the same page around some basic truths for us to move forward in a loving and powerful way.
Well, you do have your work cut out for you, but it's something that we need now more than ever. And I think that you're really much further ahead of the curve, on the curve than you know, because to go into a Trump ascendant America in the post-Obama period really is a radical thing. Because many people coming off of the excitement of those 8 years with President Obama and his family, to go into we all expected Secretary Clinton to win.
Mm-hmm.
And when she didn't, it was stunning. And it was in that context that you went to speak to people.
Yeah.
Why did you feel that was that moment? Because I think they were kind of sort of at that moment again.
Yeah, I mean, one, I grew up in a very rural community, especially the first part of my life. We, lived in a town of, 900 people. You had to drive 40 miles to get to a town of 20,000, which to me and my little brother might as well have been New York City. So I know what it's like. And that, one of the communities I lived in was, a healthy 900 person community in terms of kind of economically. And the two main employers have left town. Those jobs have really been replaced by opioid addiction and meth labs. And I think, things are just really, you go down the whole downtown, there's nothing left but a gas station. Everything's gone. And so I think, one, I have empathy and understanding for folks there. And so do a lot of folks here. And I think we feel like if we are not engaged in helping people all across the country make meaning of the moments we're in, somebody else will. And I mean, one experience we had in 2016 was one of our organizers in North Carolina found a flyer that said, are you struggling with addiction? This is not your fault. If you're at the end of your rope, call us. We can help you. And the signatory at the end of the flyer was a white nationalist organization. So you have white nationalists out trying to engage people around their pain, organizing around services, and trying to help people make meaning. This isn't Fox News. This isn't Rush Limbaugh. This is like, people that wear the fact that they're white nationalists, as a badge of honor, trying to help people make meaning. And we got to be out there helping people make meaning. And we can do that through media and lots of other means, but we think there's nothing more powerful than sitting on your front porch and having a conversation.
Before we go, is there anything else that you would like to say? I mean, I think that the work that People's Action, and I think that your podcast, To See Each Other, is so necessary now, employing radical empathy. And you employ radical empathy, I'm a woman of faith, when it's most difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Loving your enemy is the hardest thing to do. Understanding someone with whom you don't share the same views. I mean, and maybe because you have had these different experiences. I mean, you are a very empathetic man. I mean, what else, what can you leave us with? What thought can you leave us with, particularly in a moment that is fraught with so much tension and uncertainty for all of us?
Yeah. I'll say this, I'm not suggesting I think there are a bunch of people that are a bunch of different segments of Trump voters. It's just one way of thinking of the world. And so I'm not suggesting people call up or try to open their hearts in the same way around the folks that stormed the Capitol. That's a big ask. But I think right now, I think as a society, we're on one path, which is you and I don't see eye to eye. Therefore, we're not going to be in relationship. Goodbye. And I think there's a more generative and hopeful path, which is I actually really want to understand what you're up against. I really want to understand how you came to see the world the way you do. And I want to be vulnerable with you and share what I'm up against and how I came to see the world. We don't have to see eye to eye, but let's keep talking. And I think that is a progressive superpower, is empathy, curiosity, trying to understand people. And I think if we employ it, good things are going to happen.
Instead of being autocratic, let's be democratic, right?
Yes.
Blessings to you, George Gale, everyone. This podcast, To See Each Other, is something that you really, really, really need to listen to, because we do need to see each other and people need to take action. Blessings to you, George Gale.
Hey, thanks for having me.
As we continue continue to reflect on the 2020 election. We continue to look at the groups that were organizing the record voter turnout in states all around the country, states like Georgia, like Arizona, that led to record voter turnout. Well, one of those groups is Mi Familia Vota, working to engage, educate and inform Latinx voters in states like Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, Texas, and Florida. But most recently, they were working in Georgia for the runoff elections, the Senate runoff elections. And it was thanks to the Latino vote that we have seen Democrats being elected in many offices in these states. Well, joining us now to talk about this is Hector Sanchez Barba, who is the CEO of Mi Familia Vota. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Tell us a little bit about what that organizing looked like. I know you have 7 pillars of community organizing that you work through. What is that? What does community organizing look like around the elections in the Latino community?
Yeah, we are recognized as the strongest organization in the Latino community from the field operation perspective, the people that are in the communities, the people that are in the doors, in the schools, in the churches, etc. This was a very challenging and different year because of COVID. Obviously, COVID has been a top priority for us, and safety in our community has been a top priority. So I immediately called all the staff and all the field operations to stay home, and we were implementing everything from a digital perspective. But we know, and all the research shows, that the best way to communicate with our community is one-to-one in the supermarkets, at the doors, etc. So we made a strong decision 3 months before the election to come out and be in the communities, because our community needs this information, and we're a trusted organization. So we invested in the highest level of safety for our people on the ground related to COVID, 3 layers of security, never getting close to the people. And we saw a historical turnout. People really needed to hear from us, guide them, especially in the moment in which we had probably the worst levels of misinformation coming from the White House and Trump and any other organizations related to these extremist right-wing movements, really providing misinformation and bad elements that were confusing our community and also intimidating the community. So it was critical for us to be talking to people.
Well, what does that look like? Because there were so many documented cases of intimidation and misinformation, but specifically targeted to the Latino community. Take us through what exactly happened and what that looked like.
I could be talking to you for an entire hour about the specific examples, but let me give you some highlights, especially from the electoral point of view. In spaces where we have offices and field operations like Florida and Arizona, that were so critical to define this election. Let me use those 2 examples. In Florida, obviously, all the miscommunication and misinformation in communities about communism and how Biden was a communist and intimidating people and providing a lot of misinformation. We also saw information in Spanish providing the wrong dates related to anything on elections. So it was saying vote on November 5th or vote, etc., providing wrong phone numbers, etc., in Spanish. So people were really confused, and that is why the role of Mi Familia Vota was so important, to provide the most honest information, the most honest guidance, the most honest education on voting and where those politicians stand in the context of our priorities. In other states like Arizona and Colorado, we saw a number of misinformation from a continuation of all the communist approach, but also intimidation from the perspective of immigration. Many information intimidating people of mixed status families. Maybe somebody was undocumented and telling them that if they voted, it was going to have an impact on their houses. We saw, and we have seen in recent times, intimidation at the polling places, Trump supporters standing there. We saw in a number of situations now and in the past, the Border Patrol. And we also saw police, etc. As a community, minorities have had a challenging interaction in many cases with law enforcement for obvious reasons of brutality and just intimidation. So we saw a lot of these different elements in the states where we work. And it was so important for us to make sure that voters had the most reliable information and that they come out and vote. And we saw the historical number of Latinos coming out and vote, the highest in our history.
Well, 2020 was a big year. There was so much going on. But one of the things that really is connected to not just the past election, but elections going forward and representation is the census. I know that you also played a big role in encouraging Latino participation in the census, but that process was also targeted by misinformation and intimidation. Take us through that and how important that was in terms of future elections.
Is very important. The census is at the heart of our democracy, at the heart of political power. It's a constitutional duty for everybody to participate and be counted in the census regardless of the legal status, and it represents political power in our nation. So the Trump administration had a very strong campaign of intimidation and exclusion of immigrants and Latinos, in particularly in the census, targeting literally everything. It was a constant fight related to the census, when the census is directly related with the beautiful elements of democracy and everybody participating, everybody become counted. It is a way to understand the shape and the structure of our nation. And these anti-democratic forces pushing for affecting the census in this way is unacceptable. And it's bad for any democracy when communities are undercounted. So it had some impact. We still are working on the issue of the census on 2021, making sure that our community is not undercounted, and also connecting this to redistricting. Mi Familia Vota is working on redistricting this year. That is also directly correlated to political power. But yeah, the census sometimes is not at the center of the national discussions on politics, but it's so important. And it was particularly targeted by Trump and this administration.
Well, that idea of building real political power for the Latino community, you sent out a statement on New Year's Eve, Hector, saying that you built Latino political power for the 2020 election and you want to continue to build that power going forward. So what does that look like? What are you calling for under a Biden administration?
Historically, we have been excluded from the decision-making process and the most important tables of power. We're the most underrepresented group when it comes to the most important spaces of power in the nation. We have some research to show that. So in the one hand is holding extremist politicians accountable like Biden. We have a full campaign with a focus, on Trump. We have a full campaign focusing on Trump. First of all, to get him out of office, vote him out of office. Now to hold him accountable. I don't care if we have only less than a week for inauguration. We need to make sure that we send a message of democracy, that nobody is above the law. This is about accountability. This is a message for any politician now and in the future that wants to engage in acts of corruption, in acts of nepotism, that are promoting hate and violence. We saw this from the very beginning with Trump. But at the same time, this is a message for all the politicians on accountability. I had a town hall meeting with President-elect Biden actually 1 year ago. And it was a very intense town hall because I was asking specific questions of commitments. And he delivered so far on a number of those. I asked him, can you commit to have 4 Latinos or Latinas in your cabinet? Today we have 4 Latinos, 3 Latinos and 1 Latina in the cabinet. I asked him on immigration, can you commit to have immigration reform introduced in the first 100 days? Yesterday, Vice President Harris announced that they will introduce immigration reform. So this is about accountability. It's not siding with one or the other. It's about keeping everybody accountable and just working in a democratic way to advance agendas that are good for the nation. We were literally kicked out of the White House for 4 years. We don't have a single element of access, 20% of the population. That is unacceptable. And obviously with the Biden administration, we look forward to engage in many issues or disagree on issues that we don't agree, but that's the beauty of democracy.
And of course, central to immigration reform is dealing with DACA and allowing those young people who were brought here as children some pathway forward. Are you hopeful now that DACA and the Dreamers, something will happen with that?
No doubt. Immediately, we asked him to commit on DACA, and he has been on record saying that he will have executive orders on DACA immediately on day one. We look forward to seeing that and continue putting pressure on that. But it's DACA, it's TPS, it's immigration reform, it's the most vulnerable workers. Essential workers have been in the front lines protecting us and our economy from COVID. So we look forward to this level of accountability with Biden and with all the politicians in the nation.
Well, just as we finish up, Hector, there really is a tendency, I think, from the political parties and really society to look at Latino voters as a monolith, as if all, Latino voters have the same concerns. You're working in urban areas and rural areas in different states. Tell us exactly what we need to know and what we need to understand about Latino voters so we can understand that going forward, but also so we can ensure proper representation.
And that's the beauty of our community, the unity that we have and the things that make us unique, but at the same time, the amazing diversity and the backgrounds and the levels of optimism, etc. So we invite everybody to understand our community, talk to the Mexican community, the Puerto Rican community, the Central American community, the Colombian, the Venezuelan, etc. I don't want to leave anybody out, but that's the richest elements. And we saw something from the Biden campaign that was really specifically talking to the different communities, but at the same time, bringing an element of unity to move forward. So that's what makes our democracy and the tapestry of our nation so unique and so diverse. And we should celebrate it and not deny it and shut the doors to those elements.
Well, Hector Sanchez Barba, who is the CEO of Mi Familia Vota, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
The country is still reeling from what played out in Washington, D.C. last week. And the FBI is warning of more potential violence in the run-up to the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden. There are also increasing calls for unity, but also accountability. So what does that look like? We're going to get into that now with our next guest. Liz Hume is with the Alliance for Peacebuilding. Liz, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me and talking about this really critical issue right now facing the United States.
Well, your organization is, I think, most closely associated with working in other countries, yet for years you have been warning that what's happening in other countries is happening here and that we need to focus peace-building efforts here in the US. Take us through some of the dynamics that you've been observing, and then we'll talk about what peace-building looks like here in America.
Okay, so, the Alliance for Peacebuilding is a membership-based organization. We represent over 130 plus organizations in the United States and abroad globally. And we have, prior to about 2015, we're really only looking internationally, looking at conflict-affected and fragile states. In about 2015, a couple of us were talking. It's pretty hypocritical to be looking at all these other countries and saying, what's driving conflict, what's, who are these key actors, what's happening, without taking the same analysis and applying it in our own backyard. And we really felt there was a hypocrisy there, coupled with the fact we also have a lot of knowledge. The US government and other donors, the UN, have been funding programs for decades now overseas. There is a lot of learning and finding. There's been a lot of good work that people are doing here already, but there is a lot of learning that we can apply to our own increasingly flawed democracy, as The Economist calls it now.
Well, there's this idea that America exports democracy and exports peace building, but doesn't have the retrospective, look or the introspective attitude to what's happening here in the US. And in an article that the Alliance for Peacebuilding wrote back in June, long before the elections, that article started with Americans can no longer hide behind a vision of US exceptionalism. What do you mean by that? And how does that relate to what's happening right now?
So interesting, that article that I wrote with other senior US government officials. We had, many of us had been working for the US government, for the US International, USAID, the International Assistance. And we had developed in the early 2000s, the US government's conflict assessment framework that we were looking at in other countries. So Nigeria, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, we were applying this conflict analysis that we had developed and addressing what are the causes of conflict and what are the drivers. And we decided that, again, pretty hypocritical, we needed to take that analysis and apply it to what's happening in the United States. I had also been writing even years before this, even before the 2016 elections, that we were seeing some serious red flags, things that, in other countries we would be, sounding the alarm. And after the 2016 election, it was a little easier to get people to start paying attention, but still not. There's a lot of, you're exaggerating. We're the United States, we're exporting all of this stuff. So that article was intended, as were some of the other articles that were written by other, some of the national security personnel, former personnel, to kind of give a shock to people that we can, we're not exceptional. We have incredible conflict drivers right now in the United States. Our resiliency has been our rule of law, and we have seen incredible cracks in that. Resiliency can also be good and bad. The good has been the rule of law. The bad has been, we measure our success by our how prosperous the US is. And as long as, the stock market is going up, people were like, okay, that's okay. But the economic inequality has gotten to, incredible amounts, coupled with the fact of the quality of jobs that people have. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. You were already seeing these cracks. And one of the biggest issues we're seeing right now is, and it's had led to populism all over the globe, not just in the United States. The difference is the US is, our divisions are accelerating faster than other democracies. We have a group of people that are white Christians that, either real or perceived, and perceived grievances are just as critical and just as dangerous as real ones, that they're losing status, they're losing power, they're losing influence. And so then it becomes not illogical, as one of our phenomenal members Beyond Conflict writes about, that you become, anti-democratic approaches. It's not illogical that we're going to start seeing that. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now.
Well, what would peace building look like here in the US as we move forward into 2021 under a Biden administration, given that 74 million, more than 74 million Americans voted for Donald Trump? Now, not all of them would identify certainly as white nationalist Christians. However, a significant number of them are maybe falling into that demographic, but many, many others, wouldn't. So what does it look like as we move forward? What peace building, what would that look like, or what should it look like in 2021, given that significant number of people who voted for Donald Trump in the last election?
So that is a very complex question. One of the things I see a lot of is we have to be more civil. We just have to listen to each other. We just talk to each other. We just have to get along. We are not going to talk our way out of this. This is going to be at least a generational issue that we're going to be working on. And in fact, the research shows us that when we talk together online or, person to person, which is obviously very rare now, when we are talking about these issues, we become more polarized. So, you can't just do that. That's not the answer. And in fact, we're doing more harm. This is going to be really complex. And part of it is we just had an emergency meeting yesterday with many of our members to go through policy recommendations for the new Biden-Harris administration and the new 117th Congress. And the first thing I say is, one, you have to acknowledge it. You have to say that we need data. And there's some really good organizations out there doing it, like ACLED, I know the ADL, the Southern Poverty Law Center has really good data and stats on the surge in hate crimes, what's happening with white nationalism, that we're seeing more violence. So one, we have to accept it. And not everybody accepts it. And this doesn't even mean Democrat or Republican. People have to acknowledge and accept this. They have to understand that we have fallen down on every peace index. Like I said, The Economist has now ranked us a flawed democracy. And we have lost trust in our institutions, except for the military. That's the only one that we're not seeing a decline in trust. So what do we have to do? We have to acknowledge it. We can't talk our way out of it. We have to fund it, we have to resource it, and we have to elevate it at a level within our national government. This is, and we have to ask ourselves, we have the ability to fix this, but we have to ask ourselves, are we going to do it? Putting Susan Rice, Ambassador Susan Rice, at the head of the DPC Council, the Domestic Policy Council, and trying to elevate that to the level of the National Security Council. Everybody knows what the NSC is. Has anybody ever heard of the DPC? No. That has to be energized. It has to be robustly funded. It has to and have the attention of some of the senior most people in the U.S. government, and make sure that we're coordinating, because there's not one agency in the U.S. like USAID or the State Department that's working in country X. You have Health and Human Services, you have the Department of Homeland Security, you have the Department of Education, you can go on and on and on and on. So there has to be a coordinated, integrated effort. And I'll say this, we worked really hard with one of our members, Mercy Corps, to pass a Global Fragility Act to globally, to say this is how the US government is going to work in some pilot countries, and how we are going to use a conflict prevention strategy looking at a country. The irony is we passed it globally. We need something like that here. But again, you have to fund it. If we fund the national, if Congress funds the national, the NED, the democracy program with the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute for Democracy, we need to be funding these programs here. We need our own democracy fund that was put up in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan to look globally. We got to look at it here. We have to fund organizations that are on the ground that are doing this work. We need to look at, through the Department of Homeland Security, they have an office that is working on prevention of violent extremism. They recognize it's no longer, we targeted everything at Muslims. That is not our problem in the United States. We have our own homegrown terrorism. And the budget in 2016 was 10 million. The office was pretty much decimated during the Trump administration. For fiscal year 2020, they had $10 million. The budget's now been increased to 20 million. That budget needs to be 200 million. What are you going to do with $20 million throughout the United States to work on preventing violent extremism? So I could go on and on and on, but these are some of the things that we have to be doing. And more importantly, we have to be looking at the evidence, what's working and what's not working, and not doing things that we know don't work. So it's a lot more to that. And well, there's two more things I'm actually going to say. One is we have to also be able to say injustice matters, structural racism matters. We have to work on these issues, and Republicans and Democrats alike have to be, doing their work. However, we also have to target the grievances of people in Southern Ohio, and the feeling that they've been left behind, they've lost their jobs. There's been a massive drug with oxycodone devastating these communities, and people have to be able to work there. If they can't, then don't tell people in Srebrenica, Bosnia, where their families were murdered, that they have to reconcile. And we have to get into the curriculum. We have to have a shared history of what, it can't just be a whitewashed history of what we want the United States to be. And then finally, we have to give people an off-ramp. People who, I don't think people signed up for a lot of what they're seeing right now with the attack on the Capitol. People have to have an off-ramp where they, are not shamed. We have to call them in, call them back. And that's going to be a generational work. And if the government doesn't take it seriously and they're not willing to fund it and they're not willing to have it at the most senior levels, this is going to continue.
Well, just as we finish up, Liz, I mean, there's a lot obviously that needs to happen, but as there are increasing calls for unity, there also needs to be accountability as well. And I know you've been very vocal. So in the last moment or so that we have, how do you combine the two? Because some people, I think, feel they're mutually exclusive. You can have one or the other, but you can have both.
They're mutually inclusive. To have a society that is functioning and healthy and peaceful, you have to have the rule of law. And if people who have attacked the Capitol, this was a deadly attack. There has to be accountability. There has to be an accountability on inciting violence. The U.S. laws on free speech are incredibly lenient, compared to Europe, for example. But if you're inciting violence, if a reasonable person believes that this is inciting violence, you have to be held accountable for it. And the people who do those actions have to be accountable. They are not mutually exclusive.
Well, there's a lot of work being done by the Alliance for Peace Building, and I know people can find out a lot more at your website on those issues that you've touched on, including curriculum reform, because I know your organization has said, and many other peace organizations have said, the key is young people. Young people will lead us forward in peace as well. So I want to thank you very much, Liz Hume, with the Alliance for Peace Building. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Our team here at Democracy on the Brink want to thank you for participating on this show. We especially want to give our thanks to our guests, George Gale of People's Action and the To See Each Other podcast, Hector Sanchez Barba of Mi Familia Vota, and Liz Hume of the Alliance for Peace Building. Indeed, these grassroots organizers are doing what Dr. King would do. They're meeting people, not just in big speeches and in big venues, but they're going to people and where their needs are. Indeed, as we commemorate and celebrate the life and works of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King on what would have been his 91st birthday weekend, we hope that you will leave this show encouraged to get involved. We hope that you will know that you yourself really do matter. Dr. King, to paraphrase, said that all of us cannot be famous, but we can all serve. We all fit somewhere. As I think of Hector Sanchez Barba, I think of Dr. King's alliance with Cesar Chavez as he was working with him, and Dolores Huerta to get Latinx workers to Washington, to occupy Washington so that they could put a face on poverty. I think of the alliance that he would have had with George Gale as he would have gone with him from door to door, speaking with people, making the case for the voiceless, and helping people to get registered to vote. and to know that they matter. I think of what he would be doing with a Liz Hume as she would build this alliance for peace building, letting people know that the bombs we drop overseas explode at home. Indeed, he'd be working with all of these three great people today, but he'd be working with you too. And so we want you, in the spirit of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, to get involved, and do all that you can to bring this great country of ours back from this democracy, which hangs precariously on the brink. I'm Santita Jackson on behalf of the Democracy on the Brink team. God bless you and good day.